Heather's the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, contributing editor of City Journal, and a New York Times bestselling author. Recipient of a number of prizes, and books that are of particular relevance to us today, aside from others that she's written. War on Cops from 2016, bestseller, warns that race-based attacks on the criminal justice system from the Obama White House on down are eroding the authority of law and putting lives at risk. Dovetails with your other more recent book, Diversity Delusion, which is where a lot of these things are being born and propagating. So glad to see you, Heather. Welcome. Glad to have you. I was just watching your 2016 Pocket Claremont McKenna, which they had, you weren't allowed to speak to an actual audience at Claremont McKenna. Black Lives Matter already in 2016 was protesting, trying to shut you down. And, but the talk was introduced by a lovely young girl saying she does believe that there's systemic racism. She does believe African Americans have all kinds of problems, that there is systemic racism in the police force. And then you went on to hopefully dispel all of that. So your book, War on Cops, you dove deeply into the myth of systemic racism and how this really hurts us. Can you share some of the statistics that you found and why this is relevant today?
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you for inviting me to AMA, and I do look forward to seeing you in person. You've got a standing invitation.
Yes, thank you.
If the farmers market ever opens, I'm surprised that California actually is crazier than New York City. I thought it was going to be, in fact, coming to a place of liberation, but it's locked down here, and you can't even walk around a farmer's market. You have to drive through, which is impossible. So I don't know. Irvine is probably the most left-wing city in Orange County, maybe Santa Ana. So I don't know. People are wearing masks outdoors, running in the great vast outdoors, which is a complete misapprehension about the risk. But anyway.
Crazy. Well, welcome to Southern California.
Yeah, and the Santa Anas to boot.
Right.
We have been living through probably the worst 3 months of government decision-making in U.S. history. I cannot find anything comparable as far as the policy blunders that we've been seeing, starting with the coronavirus, and then the failure and the overreaction with the shutdowns, and then the failure to protect property when it was being not just shut down, but actually burned down.
Right.
I'm amazed that anybody pays any more attention to government officials, because as far as I'm concerned, they have utterly lost their legitimacy. And you look at CNN and MSNBC, and they're now back to very seriously talking about wearing masks and being careful about social distancing, after we just saw the utter hypocrisy of the with regards to the riots. So the cops narrative is the one that has driven us into this latest cataclysmic attack on property, on livelihoods, on prosperity, on the beauty of economic commerce. And the fundamental failure or lie or lacuna in all official discourse about policing is to ignore crime. It is not allowed ever to talk about crime in the United States. Why? Because it is so disproportionately committed by Blacks and to a lesser extent by Hispanics. I'm going to be very blunt here. The face of violent street crime in the United States today is Black and Hispanic. It's as simple as that. The only children getting gunned down in drive-by shootings in this country are Black and Hispanic. It is not happening to whites. Whites' children rarely get killed in the mass shooting at a school. The country completely freaks out. The media pay attention. This becomes a national catastrophe. there is a, you know, a school shooting equivalent every couple of months in the Black community, and the media does not give a damn. Why? Because if you talk about Black crime, that necessitates, if you're consistent and honest, talking about rather Black victimization, you have to talk about Black crime. And this country, far from being white supremacist, is the most generous, tolerant country in the world, and does not want to talk about the breakdown of the family and the social catastrophe that is inner city culture. The people who confront this on a daily basis are the cops. They say things that are unimaginable to the average American. The depravity of these teenage dropouts, throwing their gang signals on their social media accounts, posing with their massive armamentarium of pistols, loaded semi-automatics, the child abuse by drug-addled mothers, you know, on their sixth child by 4 different fathers. The cops deal with this, and it weighs heavily on them, and they are not allowed to talk about it. They have to walk around with the weight of this social disintegration weighing on their souls. So the fundamental lie of the anti-cop narrative is to inevitably use the wrong benchmark. We're talking about policing. Anytime you see an accusation of racial profiling or disparate arrests or disparate stops on the basis of race, look at that article, listen to that story on CNN and MSNBC, and if you read carefully, you will see that what is going on is the analyst is comparing police activity to population data. And so,
right.
I'll give you a concrete example. In New York City, Blacks are 23% of the population. They make up about 53% of all of the pedestrian stops that the New York Police Department makes. Those are the Terry stops and from a 1968 Supreme Court case, Terry v. Ohio, stop, question, frisk. This is a wholly discretionary thing that an officer does, gets out of his car or stops if he's on foot patrol, asks a few questions of somebody acting suspiciously. Well, so the anti-cop activists say, aha, Blacks are 23% of the population, 53% of all stops are Blacks. Therefore, the cops are racially profiling and they're discriminating against Blacks. What they will not tell you in that analysis is that Blacks commit about 3/4 of all shootings in New York City. If you add Hispanic shootings to Black shootings, you account for over 98% of all shootings. So when we hear about police racism, it is inevitably in a vacuum about crime. But policing today is data-driven. The cops hope against hope every time they get a shots fired call coming over their radios that for once they will be given a description of a white suspect. It virtually never happens. So they're brought into high crime neighborhoods, encountering violent, armed, and resisting suspects. That is the thing that most predicts officer use of force. Blacks make up about a little under 1/4 of all people fatally shot by the police each year. For the last 5 years, the Washington Post has been keeping a database on fatal police shootings, and it has remained remarkably stable. Despite all the pressure on cops, the number of people shot by the cops each year is 1,000. The proportion of Blacks overall has stayed relatively stable, about 1/4. All of those 1,000 victims and almost all of the 1/4 or so of Black victims are almost all armed and dangerous.
Oh.
But if you look at the unarmed category, which is what we were told was the whole purpose of Black Lives Matter,
Right.
with the Pacific, our first gentle giant, you know, George Floyd is our next giant. He's now the gentle giant, but Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri was the first gentle giant that set off the riots in Ferguson and gave the real catapult to the Black Lives Matter movement. It was all about unarmed blacks because and Michael Brown was a classic example of how the Washington Post classifies unarmed blacks, because what was Michael Brown doing? He was trying to grab the officer's gun. And a suspect who tries to grab an officer's gun has put that cop on notice. I intend to kill you.
Right. So what about hands up, don't shoot? Come on. We know, everyone knows he was this sweet, gentle giant. Hands up, don't shoot. All the people on television, hands up, don't shoot.
Right.
Are you saying that's not true?
No, it's one of the many. But let me give you one more number,
Yeah.
Karen, and we can go back to discussion.
Yeah.
The number of unarmed blacks that have been shot each year has gone down. In 2015, it was about, the Post was categorizing them, and again, the unarmed category is completely bogus, but it was about 36. Last year, it was 9. So 9 allegedly unarmed blacks. One guy last year was escaping from a lawful car stop in a car in Newark, New Jersey, had a loaded semi-automatic pistol in the car with him. He gets to be counted as unarmed. So 9 out of a population of about 23 million blacks in the country. And the more relevant comparison is how many blacks are killed each year in homicides by other blacks? 7,500. So those 9 unarmed victims of police shootings is 0.1% of all blacks killed by homicide. The police are not the problem in the black community. The police are the answer.
Right.
The problem is crime and family breakdown.
So if Black lives really did matter, as is the chant and as is the disruption, they're completely looking in exactly the wrong place and at the wrong time. They would be looking in their communities, seeing what's happening on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, and not, right? I mean, they would be doing something completely different. They would be addressing the 7,500, not the 9, seems to me.
The hypocrisy is stunning. They don't give a damn.
Yeah.
The media doesn't give a damn. I'm not one to throw around the racist term, but I am tempted to use it to describe the media, because they also don't give a damn about Black lives. They turn their eyes away as well. The only time that they care about a Black life is it's been shot by a white cop. Even if shot by a Black cop, that doesn't really get them too upset. But white cops are the only thing. And again, the numbers do not justify this narrative. We are tearing down our cities. We are now about to embark on the biggest tsunami of racial preferences that you have ever seen. Anybody who's been following the fate of ACA 5 in the California legislature, this is the bill to reverse Ward Connerly's great life work of Prop 209 in 1996, the voter constitutional change that allegedly purported to ban racial preferences in government. And of course, there were lots of workarounds. But ACA 5, which is one of many efforts since then to undo Prop 209, it is now a shoo-in.
You know, 209, let me just back up for those who don't know. Prop 209 was passed by a majority of California voters in 1996 that eliminated racial preferences, affirmative action in hiring and admissions. And as you say, there were plenty of workarounds because one has to. And you document this in Diversity Delusion. You go through the whole thing, which is a stupendous book, by the way. And yes, ACA 5 is to literally reverse that, which means to reestablish racial preferences. And I think you even say that requiring government to treat everyone equally, in their opinion, violated the Equal Protection Clause. I mean, you can't make this up. They're saying that to treat people equally is to violate equal protection. And now ACA 5 is, I was talking to Matt Malkin actually about exactly this. How can you go against something that's going to give racial preference to African Americans? How can you justify that in this climate? You can't.
No, it's going to be, this is just, I just choose this because we're in California, but this is going to be amazing. Yeah. You know, we've already seen this massive uprising of woke scientists. I've been documenting the pressure on sciences to hire, promote based on race, something that is utterly irrelevant, obviously, to finding a cure to Alzheimer's disease or, you know, a vaccine for the coronavirus. It's already been going on. The federal government has already been using hundreds of millions of your taxpayer dollars to fund research in alleged heteronormativity in mathematics or microaggressions in engineering, and awarding grants on the basis of sex and race. But this moment that we're living through, which has come about with hurricane speed, of every single institution in the United States embracing the lie of white supremacy, is going to be the final death knell for meritocracy. It's over. Any corporation you work in from here on out, the universities, I mean, they're the source of all this.
Right.
They've already been absolutely committed to racial and sex preferences. It's going to be so much worse. And all based on both the lies about policing and the lies about American society generally.
You wrote about the Evergreen situation, where, and many others, where it's not just how they propagate these lies of diversity, but they, years before the horror that we're seeing now, they have inflicted terror upon universities and professors, even professors on the left. If you don't do as we demand, we're going to shut everything down. And they hold people hostage, and so, like, literally hostage. So this has been brewing for some time, and universities, it seems, have felt the sting of all this. We just heard a UCLA professor let go in the last few days because he wouldn't give extra time for finals to African American students because of all the unrest that's happening now. So they've been doing this, right? You've been documenting this, watching this. They are hostage, and they've capitulated completely.
Well, you've lived it, Karen, unlike me.
Yes.
I observed it.
That is true.
We have here an actually living example of the rage against diverse opinion, the rage against anybody who challenges their hegemony on what is allowable thought. I am very reluctant to shed a tear for the New York Times. It is already a parody of a newspaper. Nevertheless, I'm actually disturbed by the fact that the editorial page editor, James Bennett, went through a ritual resignation. You better believe he was pushed out for publishing an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton that denounced the rioting and suggested that if it was not suppressed locally, it would be justified to bring in the military, something which I'm not an expert on, but I do believe that that is the paramount duty of government, to protect civil society. The Black workers at the New York Times used a complaint that was right out of academic discourse. And it's just, you know, you gave the award to James Damore
Right.
from Google, the same rhetoric. We are unsafe. Our lives are threatened by something that has been said. This maudlin, self-pitying victimology of I'm unsafe is pure academic rhetoric. So this was used at the New York Times to sack this guy.
Right.
I had recently, an underling at the opinion page had reached out to me to write an op-ed for them saying, well, could you write something that says that, well, certainly all our so-called protests, AKA riots, do deserve a response, but the defunding is not justified, but here's some other responses we could do. And my response to him was, I don't believe the protest riots deserve a response. Just because something like this exists does not mean that the cause is right. And I don't think that the policing profession as a whole is in need of reform. Sorry, I mean, this may sound, you know, stubborn and closed-minded, but the idea that policing has not been under constant reform for decades is ludicrous. It is the height of professionalism to date, which isn't to say that there are not atrocious misfires like we saw in Minneapolis, but that is not representative. But anyway, he was not, when I said I would write something different, he wasn't willing to publish that. So he said, thank you, you know, maybe we'll come back to you later. What worries me now is that these news organs that were already incredibly hostile to a range of viewpoints are going to become even more narrow. And the elites are going to be even less exposed to anything that challenges their way of thinking. And frankly, conservatives are going to be driven even further into their conservative enclaves. And the impossibility that we already are experiencing of trying to speak across the ideological divide, of finding any common ground. And I sometimes ask myself, like, where does the division begin? Like, where do I start to agree with the left? And then we start to branch off. And, you know, it may even be, it begins with biology, you know, as simple as there's men and women. So we can't even agree on that.
We can't agree on that.
I don't know where we start, but this is a very, very worrisome time. And it comes out of the university. Anybody who has been turning his eyes away from the university for the last 3 decades, now you see what we were warning you against.
Right, but you're right. How do you breach the divide? But before I want to talk about how impossible that feels, there's a couple other points that you've made that I think are really salient as we go forward trying to do what we do. A police officer is 18.5 times more likely to be killed by a black man than a black man is to be killed by a police officer.
And an unarmed black man.
An unarmed black man. That's a stunning number. That speaks to exactly the danger that our police officers are putting themselves in. Literally, not just anecdotally, but literally that number every day. As you said, where they have to go is horrible, but it's not just horrible. 18.5 times more likely to be shot. That's really an astounding thing.
Well, over a decade, black males have committed 42% of all fatal cop shootings, though they make up 6% of the population. So the disparity there is huge. Now, you know, the cops have like 385 million civilian contacts a year. There's tends to be under 100 fatal police shootings a year. So the odds are still small. Nevertheless, I once had after one of the overhyped shootings in New York City, maybe 15 years ago, the Sean Bell shooting. This was a guy who was at a bachelor party on his way to his wedding, and there'd been reports of a gun. and this was in Queens, a Queens strip club, and the cops followed him, and there was a chase, and Bell was killed. The attorney for the detectives union said to me, we would be willing to concede that it may be the case that an officer confronted with a black male in a very suspicious situation may be a hair trigger faster to pull that trigger than with a white male, if the other side would acknowledge the facts of crime that make us nervous. Because again, if you're going to be shot and you're a cop, the likelihood is far greater that you're going to be shot proportionally by a black male. And the resistance in the inner city to arrests is huge.
Right.
People fight the cops. You know, this is not to justify the George Floyd arrest, because most of the cops I've spoken to say once somebody is cuffed, it should end there. I've had a few cops tell me, no, it doesn't. Somebody, even a suspect who's cuffed, can injure an officer. That is a minority view.
Mm-hmm.
Most people say, no, you get them in cuffs, you sit them up and you wait for the ambulance. But these officers, you know, they are confronted, and we will see if the body cam footage is ever released. My guess is we will see George Floyd very viciously resisting arrest. And it also remains the case, I mean, almost all of the highly publicized cop shootings of black men, almost all of them were resisting arrest. So here's a very simple solution that nobody also is willing to talk about. If you don't want to get killed by a cop and you're interacting with him, don't resist arrest. It's that simple. Challenge it later.
That sounds pretty clear. I think it was even Kid Rock who made a video to that effect. Here's what you do. Yes, officer, no officer, right? And that's that.
Yep.
But what we have instead is we have kids brought up, and we're seeing this now, it's coming out like crazy, kids being told by their parents to fear the police. Parents who say, you know, I worry about my black son with the police because we have rampant racism. So the fear isn't actually because of the police, but because of this false narrative, these lies. And so what we've got is this cycle that's created that the police had nothing to do with creating.
That's right.
But their own communities are. And it's become impossible. You know, you wrote about Amy Wax too. Here are those things that lead to success in life. But even to say that is racist. If you behave sort of culturally appropriately, that brings success, but you're not allowed to do that. You're not allowed to say fathers matter, intact families matter, education matters, good diction matters, work ethic matters, right? Right now, I believe Black Lives Matter. And to me, the way to get to having all lives matter, just to be clear, the way to improving the situation is to enforce those kinds of, not enforce, help put in place those kinds of things, but you're not allowed to. And what we see, and I think you wrote about this too, Black kids who try to excel in school, it's their colleagues, their classmates who put on the pressure, not white people, not to succeed. How do you break that? And is this correct? Is this narrative what you're seeing too?
Oh yeah, I am actually losing patience with the well-meaning sort of plea that, well, we have to fix the schools.
Mm-hmm.
It's not for us, it's not for we to fix the schools anymore. We have been trying to fix the schools for 4 decades. there's not a reform that hasn't been tried, whether it's on the right or the left. At this point, it's up to the people themselves in that culture to change. But what we're going to live through, again, this is what's going to happen next weeks, in the next month, in the next year, is everything is going to be about racism. And if it were ever possible to talk about what I call the myth of bias, which is that the only allowable explanation for racial disparities is bias, not behavior, not culture,
Right.
the academic skills gap. It was already very difficult to talk about that. Now it is going to be impossible. Impossible. But here's a thought experiment that I propose in the diversity delusion. So now, again, there are clear racial disparities in household income, in household wealth, in representation, in the STEM fields, in law firm partners. So the dominant narrative, the only explanation is bias.
Right.
Okay, so let's have a thought experiment. If Blacks acted like Asians in all things relevant for success for 10 years, so Asian levels of out-of-wedlock child rearing, which are now for Asians about 16%, which is surprisingly high. It would be very much lower in Japan or South Korea, I can guarantee you. But for Blacks, it's about 73%. So same proportion of Black kids being raised by two married parents, an academic achievement ethic rather than a contempt for academic
Right.
ethic, which is the anti-acting white ethos that dominates in the inner city. Attending school rather than being truant. Blacks are truant in California at 5 times the rate of the rest of the state. Taking your textbooks home to do your homework, that would be nice. Don't beat up your teacher. Don't sit in class with your back to your teacher and your earbuds in. Don't join gangs. Don't do drugs. Graduate from high school. That's all that's necessary for academics. If for 10 years Blacks did those things which are within their capacity,
Right.
acted like Asians, and we still saw these disparities, then I'm going to entertain the bias explanation. But at the moment, when the behavioral disparities are so glaring, they're so vast, it is way premature to say the only allowable explanation is bias. But buckle your seatbelts and hold on to your hats, because we are entering a period now that is going to be stunning in the speed at which any remaining neutral standards of meritocracy are torn down.
Who can say I'm just as chilled as you about where we're going right now, but is there a way, are there people, is there anyone who can say,
well,
face forward, bring your books home? We've seen pockets of this periodically, but for the most part, nobody seems to have the will, and that includes teachers. A friend of mine taught downtown. She was a substitute in LA. There was a student who had this amazing hair, like this. And she said to him, if you spend a fraction of the time doing your homework that you do she was fired. You're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed in any way to do anything that says you somehow are responsible for your own self. And that this racial, hairdo thing, that somehow is wrong, and that you are supposed to be the agent of your own success. You're not allowed to say that. That goes exactly, and she literally fired. How does one do this?
I don't know. You have to be very brave. You have to be very brave, because you will be called a racist. And it's a tragedy, because there are obviously Black parents who are doing the right thing and who believe in personal responsibility, but the culture doesn't reward that.
Right.
And, you know, interestingly, it just shows the white compulsion to infantilize Blacks. They're obviously terrified that the achievement gap will never close, and that after the civil rights revolution, things didn't get better. They're terrified at the possible explanations for that. But schools that did have high standards, there's a charter network called KIPP, which is an acronym, KIPP. It's knowledge, something power, I don't know. It was started by two former public school teachers from Texas, and they're part of this movement called the No Excuses Schools that script everything down to the minute for these inner city kids. Gives them no discretion. They will study this. They're all studying it at the same time. They walk in the corridors. There's lines painted on the corridors to tell them how to walk. Ritual greetings to teachers. I'm positive. When I say ritual, I'm not being dismissive. I think this is all great because it's providing them with structure that they're not getting at home. Well, so KIPP was an early progenitor of the idea that high expectations, no excuses, structure is the way to break the poverty gap. KIPP has since gone left. They now are signing on to the idea that America is structurally racist. They've become parrots of academic identity politics. There was some guy that worked for them that his bio was on the web, and it was all about his marvelous work as a college student in queer studies and queer advocacy and whatnot. So it's just another example of how hard it is in our culture to retain a no excuses attitude. America is so guilty about Blacks, and it feels that it is somehow unfair to hold them to the same standards. And as I say, I think that is driven ultimately by fear.
And there is this notion of preying on people's compassion, even though true compassion would lead them to do the KIPP way and to tough love and do those things that we know have brought success. That real compassion would be that. But it's so easy to sell this faux compassion and this shoe kissing and all of this, self debasement, the white guilt and all of this, that it makes it very difficult. I'm sorry, can you mute yourself? Makes all of this very difficult, to move forward through, because I'm sorry,
yeah, it's just again,
right? It's hard to move past this. Can't we all, you're racist if you're not doing everything to give and everything you can to our infantilizing Black friends.
Yeah, I don't know how this ends. I don't, because corporations know the truth. They know that, the idea that it is a handicap today to be Black in America. Yes, obviously, if you grow up in some of these communities that are so bereft of social capital,
yeah,
you're definitely starting behind. But if you can graduate from high school, period, with not a huge disciplinary record, there are going to be thousands of colleges in this country that are going to beat down your door and try to get you to accept their offer of admission. And if you have remotely respectable SATs, let's say 1200s, you can write your ticket to the Ivy Leagues, so, and that will continue throughout life. So being a modestly qualified Black person today is an enormous advantage. Do you want to have your white son apply to Harvard or your Black son apply to Harvard? If he's Black, he's got a 4 times greater chance of being admitted regardless of his academic qualifications. And that's true for every law firm in the country. It's true of every science lab,
Right.
every bank. It's true of every accounting firm. It's true of every newspaper. It's true of every publishing house. It's true of every foundation. And yet, you know, the dominant narrative is you have to be 3 times as good if you're Black to get Harvard to look at you. It's absurd. It's a patent lie. The universities know this. They know how their admissions process work. They know how their faculty hiring works.
Right.
Know that every single faculty hiring committee is under an ironclad mandate to bring in Blacks and overwhelmingly females, because the pipeline for Blacks that are even in the farthest ballpark qualified is so small. But
right.
still pretend they beat their chests, you know, the Gene Block, the chancellor of UCLA, or Peter Salovey, the president of Yale, beats their chests and say, oh, we're so racist. We promised to make amends. It's
Right.
beyond belief.
It is. And at the same time, as was pointed out in the chat, and I say this too, to say that Blacks can only succeed if we lower our expectations is also one of the most racist things one can say. We can't have voter ID because Black Americans will be disenfranchised. Really, they can't go get a driver's license. And this entire rhetoric is soft bigotry of low I call it the soft tyranny of low expectations, because I think it's that as well. I thought we promote self-agency, but they have been prey to the victimology, as you also talk about, right? If you grow up always being told white man is putting you down, even if white man is doing nothing of the kind, how do we break that cycle? Because it's obviously a lie. How do you combat that extent of mendacity?
I don't know. Again, like the corporate world we've seen in the last week, we knew this already, but the speed at which they have capitulated, it's just a fascinating symbol, this bowing, the bending the knee, getting down. It's really extraordinary. What it is it's Western civilization bowing down before the forces of anarchy and hatred. As you have seen for a long time, Karen, Western civilization is deemed the enemy. You were
Yes.
for saying that Western civilization is good. The elites have embraced the ludicrous idea that Western civilization is the source of oppression in the world. Just exactly the opposite. But the corporate world is craven. Academia is going to be even more terrified. There are a few voices out there. There are some people who work on either genetics or on behavior, but they're going to be cowed. So I don't know, a few of us journalists have got to push back on the myth of bias, because as long as that is, as I say, this is the key. As long as the only allowable explanation for racial disparities is bias, with what we're seeing now, everything is over. It is over. Meritocracy is over. The speed at which, people are being fired, books are being taken off, monuments coming down, gone with the wind, gone. The founders are next. We've always been wondering, well, how long is Washington and Jefferson going to stay around, or Madison, because they all had slaves? That's next.
Well, even Lincoln has been defaced, not only here, but in London, of all places. And I'm sure you get them too. I get emails from every organization, corporation, retail, anything I've ever had anything to do with, anybody. And it's all their mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. We love our African American friends. We're going to elevate our Black artists, our Black musicians, our this or that. These are the books that we recommend. These are the musical pieces. LA Phil sends this stuff of, you know, we've been so guilty in the past and we have to make up for it. And so we're featuring these 4 composers, all of whom are Black. Etsy, I don't care who these artisans are, but we're featuring Black ones. Postmates, you get a special deal if you order from a Black owned restaurant. So as exactly as you say, death of meritocracy has nothing to do with that anymore. Everything is through a racial lens, as it had been through a class lens under Marx, right? So this is just replacing the class with race. And you're not allowed to say, as Martin Luther King had said, content of character, not color of skin. Everything is about race. And it's a stunning, and you're not allowed to say all lives matter, because you clearly don't care about Black people.
I mean, anybody who has a white son, it's going to be tough for him. He's going to really be have handicaps.
Anybody who is what? I missed that.
Who has a white male son?
Who's a white male son, right?
I mean, I already know of a Midwestern evangelical school that won't even admit white males into its graduate programs because it knows they won't get hired, and it doesn't want to hurt its placement statistics. So this is going to be true forever, in many, many institutions.
And Harvard already, not most, but many of the Ivies had already not taken in Asian students because, right, they're taking a spot away. So we need to be armed with what as we go forward? Courage to talk about meritocracy, courage to say, why don't you try, I don't know, what do you think? What can we do? We who are watching our country, and as you point out on Tucker, it's not just America, it is our civilization being completely torn apart. It's all on fire right now.
Well, I guess when you get into discussions with your woke children or your woke neighbors, and they point to the lack of Black representation in any institution, it helps to start with the facts, which is the academic skills gap. Given the size of that gap, how do we possibly expect proportional representation? The National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is a nationwide test of basic skills in grammar school, 8th grade math and reading, 40% of Black 8th graders don't even score basic. The scale is below basic, basic, proficient, and advanced. So 40% of Black 8th graders are below basic in reading and math. The amount of the percentage that are in advanced is maybe 1%. The ratios are the opposite with whites and particularly with Asians. So given that, and that gap never closes.
Right.
It doesn't close in college. The SATs are vastly, the gap is there, and it continues in graduate school. Why do we expect that with reading skills like that, there will be a proportional number of Black partners in law firms or Black engineers at Google? It's simply impossible. It's a lot of this starts there. The family breakdown, that's going to be hard to get agreement on, because the main, not just the left any longer, but the sort of mainstream culture is committed to the feminist idea that strong women can do it all.
Right.
And not about to say that children need fathers, their fathers as well as their mothers. But that is also a huge, huge determinant of inequality. And point out the fact that, again, there's preferences are ubiquitous. If
right.
You people who work in businesses that are large, now small ones maybe free, blessedly free of this, but if you're in a big business, you've been through the diversity training, you know the pressure on managers to hire and promote so-called underrepresented minorities. So one can only speak the truth.
Yeah.
And hope to get back. But I don't know. This is a real question. Where do the American people stand on the riots? Where do they stand on law and order? Where do they stand on this narrative? We've been hearing from elites across the country, and that is the big question mark going into this election, obviously. Will there be a backlash against this graphic tipping point now fortunately, young people don't vote at a great rate. But young people today have been so brainwashed by academia,
right,
that they are going to serve as virus carriers into the future. So it's a question of whether the former Trump voters, which are frankly disproportionately older white voters, are going to stick with them, or are they going to turn out? Because
right.
if we get a Democrats in the White House, it was going to be bad enough. But in this current climate, a Biden administration will just be dizzying in the speed at which what worries me the most is the bench. The pressure to put Black judges on the bench who are not qualified, who are not the best legal minds, is going to be enormous, and the quality of our jurisprudence is going to suffer.
And not just at the highest level, not just the Supreme Court, but seating all the way down. We've in this conversation, we've kind of bifurcated. One is, how do we actually deal with actual lack of success on the part of Blacks? But the other part is, to what extent is this whole thing the powder keg of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter and Antifa, the racism, institutional racism, just being used as a tool towards other ends? Mayhem, chaos, tearing down Western civilization has nothing to do with actually solving anything, but it's really about sowing seeds of discontent. It's about destruction of law and order, right? Tearing down, defunding police forces. I hear that Black Lives Matter is now working with various school districts, helping them with their curricula. So one piece of this is, how do we actually deal with this disparity? But the other one is, this isn't really the issue. It's, to the left, it's never really the issue. The real issue is chaos, it's destruction, it's mayhem, it's anarchy, it's globalism. It's, how do we, what do you think this does play a role in that, or is?
Yeah, I mean, there's two types of mayhem. There's the burning, the physical thing that we've seen, and that is what happens when you back off on law and order and you release the basic, most savage instincts of the human soul. Destruction is fun. Breaking glass is fun. To be able to do that with impunity, to destroy other people's hard work when you are yourself a failure, and to be able to steal is fun. To get all this free loot. This was fun. This was not sorrowful. This was fun. So there's that. The destruction of Western civilization, is a more ideas-based venture. But yes, that's destruction as well. That's slow motion. What we saw in the last 2 weeks was fast motion.
So I'm thinking that there is a crack between the media leftist and community leftists who are uninformed, and these two issues. Make it school choice, and you'll get a lot of Black mothers.
That's the conservatives have been saying that for the last 30 years. It's not that it's a wrong answer. It's just we've tried this, and it hasn't really produced electoral results or political results. And so I don't know. I mean, we could, and I'm not against school choice. At some point, I think that conservatives have put too much hope in that, treating school as sort of a market economy. A neoliberal Alan Ehrenhalt, who used to edit a magazine called Governing, once said to me, there's nothing wrong with our schools that better students wouldn't fix. So at some point, I weary a little bit of the reflexive reaching out to the voucher issue as a way not to talk about family culture. But yeah, if you're suggesting that we reach a bargain saying, okay, we'll break the police unions if you break the teachers unions, that's an interesting idea. I'm sorry, but this has been the case for 3 decades. Conservatives keep on waiting for that voter rebellion of Black mothers that are, left out of the lottery for the charter school. It just hasn't happened yet. So this is not a new idea, unfortunately. And why it hasn't worked, I don't know, but it's not going to work now.
Kim Millman, you had a question?
Hi, thank you very much.
Hi.
I've actually, this was fascinating, but incredibly depressing.
Sorry, I'm depressed.
So my question is in a hope for the future. Number one, especially with everything you talked about with the achievement gap, and possibly with what Karen's comment with the mea culping of the entire corporate America, do you see any possibility of the pendulum swinging back and normalcy being restored? And if so, how can we get there? Because right now, it seems to me that what we're hoping on is that the angry young left doesn't vote. But other than that, it's hopeless.
I don't know any other way than the truth, and that doesn't necessarily work. But other than that, I don't know. Organizing, I don't know if it's going to come down to identity politics on the right and white identity politics. I don't know. Not that there's many. I write about these good, bourgeois, hardworking, pitiable Black residents of high crime neighborhoods who love the police. They want more of them. They believe in law and order. So it's not necessarily a racial thing at all. It is a question of values. But at this point, demographic change is against us. The Wall Street Journal editorial page keeps hoping that immigrants are this huge surge to the Republican Party waiting to happen. Hasn't happened yet. Maybe we saw a lot of these small businesses that were torched in these last riots were immigrant owned. Didn't make a damn bit of difference to the riot justifiers. But all I know is if Trump does not hold on to his base, he's doomed. And it looks from the polls that the base is eroding. Now, I'm sure there's lots of optimists who are poll skeptics, and I'm not qualified to weigh in on the veracity of any given poll, but things at the moment are not looking great. So the way you fight it, again, the fight is with the truth that we are not white supremacy. The opposite is the case. The opposite is the case. Blacks are preferred in every single institution. And we've got to be able to say that.
Do you think that this came up in the chat with everything that's gone down and how it's all been in Democrat-controlled areas, cities, states, under Democrat mayors, under Democrat governors, Democrat prosecutors, Democrat everything? Police unions and others are going to say, you know what, we've had it with you. And I hope not only police unions, but minority business owners and those who have had their businesses torched, because as you say, they were immigrant owned, they were also minority owned. We're seeing Black man after Black woman sobbing that their life's work, the promise of America, the land of opportunity, has been torched by people who they were on the same side of. So do you think that's going to help swing the political pendulum, or? I'm just trying to find a glimmer here.
That's a very good question. That's a very interesting question about the police unions. And they are completely craven for political power because they have supported Democratic politicians. Whoever's in power, they just want to make sure that they have their protections. So I'm not sure that this happened during the first iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement. 2015 and 2016 was its height with Ferguson and the Freddie Gray riots in Baltimore, where the police unions took their backing at that point in the 2016 election. But that's an interesting question. It's a question of ideology versus self-interest, and everybody keeps thinking, why is the Black vote so monolithic? And whether it's just custom or whether people, even though it's again, there is just something attractive about the victim ideology and the victim mentality and feeling like you're a victim rather than a person with agency, and the Democratic Party holds that out. I don't know, but that's I think that's a very plausible hypothesis for how maybe this gets turned around. Whether there's that many Black entrepreneurs who were burned out, or Hispanic or Asian entrepreneurs who were burned out, I don't know. And it's also the mystery in California that Asians still are predominantly Democratic. Now, we know about the wonderful Asians that Matt Malkin works with to get rid of preferences, but my impression is they're still the minority. In New York City, it's only the Chinese in the Asian community who are fighting against the evisceration of New York's gems, their jewels of the entrance exam high schools that are absolutely colorblind. And the rest of the Asians, I don't think they're particularly on board. So it seems like for immigrants, when they come into the country, and the Indians are the real mystery here because they are so successful. And yet, I mean, they're running practically every tech company up in Silicon Valley. But they too embrace the victimology and the ideology in the Democratic Party. So I can't quite explain it.
Well, there's also the victimology is one way of thinking, and yes, but also Democrats put front and center, we care about you, we care. And so it's easy to get swept up in, well, they care about us, right? It's not even a victim thing or we're going to do things, but we care, we feel your pain, we care. Where we on the right, we care, but we don't talk about caring as much. We say, here are those things. We want you to be free to succeed. We want to make sure that government gets out of the way so that you can do blah, blah, blah. Yes, we care, and we're acting out of that caring, but we don't talk about the caring as much. We don't talk about the compassion, but it's our compassion that's real. It's their compassion that's manipulative and infantilizing and power-mongering, and ours is rising tides lift all boats, and we should all succeed, and your success is my success, and I don't want anybody to be hurt, and I sure don't want kids anywhere of any color, of any kind, ever to have any kind of fear in their homes, on their streets, ever. And this is just one of the most crushing things about this whole lie that we're seeing. Kids should be elevated and safeguarded and protected and educated and their curiosities fed instead of oppressed, which is what's happening. And let alone living in fear. And as you cite, these kids are shot. Kids are shot in their own living room. David, hello.
Hi, Heather. You are just a spectacular writer, just an amazing writer. During the Nixon administration, there were the silent majority thing, and that was proved in polling, but it was kind of missed, at least middle of the campaign by the Democratic Party. Do you think that there's polling going on like this? Have you heard anything about that? I mean, there's all these people, I suspect, who are kind of angry at the extreme characterization of people who aren't part of Black lives, but aren't going to speak up about it. I'm in business, and no one in business is going to voice any kind of an opinion that isn't completely resonant with Black Lives Matter right now. But I think everyone feels like the Black Lives Matter characterizations are inaccurate, they're extreme, and resent the fact that they're being dissed all the time. What do you think about that?
I hope so. That's good to know. You think there is that resentment? Because that's the question. How craven are we? One always wonders when, you know, you have the Philadelphia Inquirer editor also fired, and because he ran an op-ed about the destruction of Philadelphia's historic architectural core, which is precious. This is our history. And so he ran a piece by a architectural preservationist saying this looting is really bad. And he ran it under the headline, Buildings Lives Matter, or a play on Black Lives Matter to say, well, buildings matter too. And so this was another meltdown moment where all the Black staffers at the Philadelphia Inquirer said that the headline, like the Tom Cotton op-ed in the New York Times, made them unsafe. So he was fired and resigned. And rather than saying, F you, you know, you have just destroyed freedom of thought, he apologized and groveled. You would think he has nothing to lose at this point. Why not speak the truth? So I'm interested to hear you say that you think that people are mouthing these bromides, these self-flagellating, nauseating protestations before lies, and they're burning up inside, they're glowering, it sticks in their craw. I hope that's the case. Whether there's polling to indicate that people are not buying this, I don't know. And, you know, Karen talks about the left weaponizing the language of compassion. Yeah,
Yes.
it's true. I cannot bring myself to say the right has to do that as well. We had George Bush doing that, but notably before the riots hit and George Floyd, during the coronavirus episode, the left-wing mainstream media was always criticizing Trump for not being empathetic enough to victims. And somehow it's supposed to matter that he would get up and say, I feel your pain. It doesn't matter at all.
Right.
The thing is going to be fixed or not based on things outside of what Trump says, but that is the requirement now of politicians, is to show empathy. And there's an interesting book by a guy at Cato, Gene Healy, that traced the presidential rhetoric over like 2 centuries, and especially the word children, that for the first century of political rhetoric and presidential rhetoric, children never showed up in anybody's speeches. And then as you get closer and closer, as the 20th century progresses, it's all this bathos about save the children and whatnot. Not to, I mean, Karen rightly cares about children, but it's not going to be your political platform. And so we become more and more saccharine and treacly, and it's all about feelings. And it's the therapeutic culture that is being pumped out of the university. So I don't know. I hope that is the hope here, is that the public has been so disgusted by the government's failure to preserve law and order, and that Trump, stays on his law and order theme, but frankly, he's not a great messenger. He just doesn't have the eloquence. He has not caved yet, really. I guess he's got some speech coming up on law enforcement, and I fear that he's going to pander again like he did on so-called criminal justice reform. And now he plays the race card against Biden, which is the height of hypocrisy, blaming Biden for being part of the federal crime bill under President Clinton, the 1994 Act, which Biden was right to do. And then here's Trump acting like Black Lives Matter, saying, well, it was racist to increase penalties for 3 strikes offenders. So we'll see what Trump does on his law enforcement speech, but I hope he doesn't back down on law and order.
And absolutely, it's always a little bit nervous making, but glad he's going to be speaking. but there hasn't been a president really that I'm aware of since Lincoln who has done more for African Americans in terms of opportunity, in terms of various prison kinds of things, right? Second chances and all of this. He's looked at other, and taking the recommendation from Kim Kardashian of all people, you might want to look at this woman's conviction, right? And he let her go. He set a woman free who under Obama remained in jail. So he doesn't have the rhetoric, but he has been, his actions have been much more pro-equality as.
Well, see, I'm disagreeing with you there, Karen, because I don't.
Good.
I think that the Second Chance Act or First Step Act or whatever it was called, it's not horrible, but it was done in the name of racial justice, and it was done in the name of the criminal justice system being racist. And Trump took the mantle on himself that I am reforming the racism of the Clinton years and the Obama years. That is the wrong message to take.
Yeah, that's a great point.
You are not, don't give any support to the left-wing narrative that the criminal justice system is racist. So yes, Alice Johnson, the crack dealer,
right,
free, she's on Fox all the time. But I think that's pure opportunism on Trump's part, and I do not support his rhetoric around that.
That's very true, and it also, and thank you for that. And it also points to how the fact of it makes no difference to the left, even though he did this, which we might not agree, you don't agree with, and I'm with you on that. He did this, and it doesn't matter to them. He's still racist and horrible, and with pandering, with appeasement, there's no end to it. Once you, right, there's no end to it. So if he thought it was going to buy him anything, he was wrong, and maybe he did it. Now he's learned his lesson, hopefully not to pander, but we'll see. There's another quote. People seem to twist and misquote statistics. What's the best source or set of resources you'd recommend for us to properly arm ourselves with the real crime and policy interaction data?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, my book, The War
Your book, yeah,
has a lot on policing data, and Diversity Delusion has a lot on affirmative action, skills gap, behavioral gap, but I don't know if there's a single source. You know, the crime sources, FBI uniform crime reports, you have to work with them. Bureau of Justice Statistics has a terrible website. So the academic skills gap, I mean, that's available College Board. They publish the SAT scores. They've increased the ranges because they don't want to show that if you get to above 750 on an 800-point scale, the gap is even larger than it appears. But anyway, let's go through questions quickly because I really need to go pretty quickly.
Yep. What do you think the impact of this during the Obamagate trials with the riots will have on the election?
What, the Obamagate trials? What? I'm sorry.
I think this is Hillary. Everything to do with Hillary right now. There's the hearings, I think, is what Courtney means with the riots. That
I don't
hearing about these things.
I know that this is not going to be popular among your members, but to me, this feels like ancient history. I think it's trivial. Who cares? Let it go. I know that I'm speaking to a bunch of Hillary haters, but I think that this is an obsession that is not going to get the Republican Party anywhere. I think you got to run on the riots, run on the fact that we need to restore law and order, run on single standards, run on meritocracy.
What about Blexit? Are you familiar with Candace Owens' Blexit? And you know Brandon Strzok, of course. This walkaway movement. Do you think they're gaining ground for us? What?
You know, Candace Owens, her now famous video about why do we keep celebrating criminals.
Right.
It's very sad. All these police martyrs, they're all criminals. It's such a betrayal of civil rights. I guess she's got a large following. Again, I don't know the numbers, but right now the weight of gravity is obviously towards Black victimology, and that's going to be hard. A siren call that is going to be hard for people to stop their ears up.
Do you know any group that is working towards doing any of those foundational, fundamental things that should be done systemically to elevate, but not, again, not that
Well, there's
the
small,
issue, but
yeah, Robert Woodson, he's been around for decades talking about self-reliance and culture. Shelby Steele isn't a group, he writes.
yes, fabulous.
So, and I guess maybe there's some small charter schools. I don't even know. Again, when Kip tipped to left, that was depressing.
Right.
There's probably still some others. I guess the Success Academy in New York is a charter school network but they sort of have somewhat of a Black nationalism ideology, but they're pretty single-minded about high standards. But other than that, I mean, there's a few. I wrote years ago about a woman in Milwaukee that was trying to break the inner city culture. So they're out there, but I don't know an obvious answer to that.
We have Jesse Lee Peterson here who's trying to support Black men to be Black fathers and rebuild the Black family. There's another question. Is it hopeless to present fatherless family as the primary causation? To me, fatherlessness is the fundamental core, the breakdown of men, of the family. Boys aren't seeing this. We did a conference on school shootings. That was one of the key elements too. Do you think if you can heal that, is that, although they won't let you?
No, it is the key issue. That is it. That is the start of it all.
Yeah.
A civilization that has lost the marriage norm is not civilizing boys. That's very tough. Not only do we have feminism in the ascendant, we have gay rights in the ascendant. So if I go to a college campus and I say children need their mothers and fathers, not only am I offending the feminists, I'm also offending the gay rights people, because you can't say that a child needs a mother and a father because you're dissing the lesbian couple. So it's very, very tough, but one has to say it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Right.
So what do you suggest we do, Heather, as we go forward? What can we do? Any hope?
Well, if you hear somebody putting the cops down, say that's just not the case. The data is there. Policing is driven by crime. They're not making these decisions. There's not an epidemic of racially biased shootings of Black men. The prison population is driven by crime, not by racism and the criminal justice.
Right.
And that just speak out against victimology and identity politics. And I don't know, what access people have to social media or whatever, but don't be cowed by being called a racist, because
just terrific. Thank you so much. And we've got to have the courage, because they're taking over, and we can't let that happen.
Right. Yeah, the speed is amazing. But anyway, it's been a pleasure talking with you and AFA. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.